Hi everyone, this is Lomi, and this week I'll be showing how to assemble the pattern I created for Rin's jacket. The base pattern is available on my site, and it's a little more complicated than the other patterns I've shared so far, so if you have any trouble understanding directions or can't see what I'm doing because my camera is zoomed in a little more than usual, don't hesitate to ask for help in the comments below. To begin, you'll want to cut out your pattern pieces and prepare them for assembly. I've pinned all my pieces together to get through this tutorial a little faster. I'm using tan micro suede for the lining, the cap sleeves, and the front flap. For the outer shell, I'm using medium weight denim blue suede. Start by sewing the cap sleeves. The bigger curve is the outside, and the shallow curve is what will attach to the jacket. Place the right sides of the fabric together and sew both sleeves and set them aside. Next, sew the shoulder seams on the lining. As always, make sure it's assembled with right sides together. Then take the pieces for the front flap and sew up one side and across the top, leaving the bottom and the other side open. Next up is the collar. Sew up one side, across the top, and down the other side, leaving the bottom of the collar open. Now we'll sew the outer shell. Since this is a different color of fabric, I stop and switch to blue thread, then sew the shoulder seams the same way as the lining, with the right sides of the fabric together. Next, we'll finish the sleeves. I use pinking shears to trim the seam allowance, which will let the seam lay better when turned right side out. You can do the same thing by cutting notches into the seam allowance with regular scissors. Then I turn it right side out, using the cap of a pen to make sure the seam is turned well. Next, I pin and measure some trim, cut it to length, and sew it on. I do a lot of trim by machine because it's faster, but it can be tricky, so you may prefer to add your trims by hand. Adding the trim before attaching the sleeve will put the raw edges of the trim inside the garment, where they won't fray. Once both cap sleeves are embellished, I fold one in half to find the center, then line the center up with the shoulder seam on the jacket's outer shell. Make sure you attach it with the trim side against the right side of the jacket body. Pin the sleeve to the jacket and then baste it together. I do this by machine, using a long stitch and sewing about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Look at me breaking my own first rule and sewing over pins. Shame on me. Once it's on, baste the other sleeve the same way. This keeps the sleeves from moving when we attach the lining, which is what comes next. Line up the sleeve hole with the jacket outer and the lining facing right sides together. Sew around the sleeve hole, leaving the jacket's sides open. Repeat this for both sides. When you turn it right side out, the lining will be neatly attached to the sleeve opening. Now we'll attach the collar. Start by trimming the corners and turning it right side out, making sure the corners are turned well. Fold the collar in half and mark the center point. Then fold the jacket in half and find the center point on it as well. Putting the pieces right sides together, line up these center points and pin it in place. Then tuck the collar in between the lining and the outer shell. Make sure the colors match. For me, the blue side of the collar should be against the blue and the tan against the tan. Pin all the layers together with the collar sandwiched in the middle. You'll notice that the collar will be about 1/4 inch too short to reach to the end of the neckline. That's exactly how it should be. We'll finish that front edge later. Sew the layers together. Then turn the whole thing right side out by pulling the front of one side through the tunnel created over the shoulder, where the lining is sewn to the jacket at the collar and the shoulder. Now that the jacket's right side out, I realized I was supposed to add trim around the sleeve hole before attaching the sleeve. I just forgot. So before I sew the sides together, I measure and cut trim for the sleeve holes and stitch it on by hand. I always like to show when I mess stuff up because it shows how it's never too late to fix a mistake, and that even when you're experienced, you still make mistakes all the time. Once the trim is sewn on, I fold one side of the jacket so the lining is against itself and the outer shell is against itself, with right sides together, making sure to line up the seam where they meet. I pin this and then sew the shell to itself and across to the lining, sewing the lining to itself. Do the same thing with the other side, so that all the raw edges are inside the garment. Next, we'll attach the front flap. I fold the corner of the collar down and pin it to keep it out of the way. Line up the finished top seam of the front flap with the edge of the collar, where the outer shell and lining meet. Pin the open edge of the flap against the edge of the jacket's front, with right sides facing each other. It's a little tricky to attach it this way, but I find it easier to turn the jacket right side out through the shoulder without these extra pieces being attached. Once it's neatly pinned, sew the flap into the jacket, going up one side and down the other. When you flip it right side out again, you'll have a neat join to the body of the jacket. Now fold the other half of the jacket, so that the front has the lining and shell sides together. Pin the edge and sew it closed. Next, we'll finish the bottom seam. Fold the jacket inside out. It will only let you fold as far as the arm seams, so it makes kind of a fabric taco with the collar stuffed in the middle. I put in a few pins to hold it, then I sew halfway across the bottom edge. I pause in the middle and move down a few inches, leaving a small gap in the bottom seam, which I'll use to turn the jacket right side out again. Once the jacket is turned, I use a dowel rod to make sure all the corners are turned neatly. Then we'll take a needle and thread and sew the gap closed by hand, using a ladder stitch. To do this stitch, alternate which sides you sew on. One stitch through the tan, one stitch through the blue, one stitch through the tan, until it's all the way closed. seam will barely be noticeable when done. Knot your thread in the seam, and then all that's left is finishing work. I make the gray patch for the shoulders out of suede I cut free-handed, then add studs and pin it in place. I stitch it on by hand, adding the straps on the points as I anchor it to the main body of the jacket. The straps are made from vinyl, with more studs to look like buttons. I add trim around the edge of the whole thing with my machine, then add straps with buckles for front closures by sewing and backstitching over the straps for a good hold. I also use embroidery floss and a whip stitch to add the accent stitching on the collar, and add the silver cords and buttons across the back with fabric glue. Now his jacket is finished and is looking great! There aren't too many steps left, but I've already started the pattern for his pants, and I'll be working on them next. Thanks for joining me again. See you next time!